I'm trying to make you do something without telling you to do it, like a non-intrusive video game tutorial would do. Is it working? Okay, well maybe I'll say something about all the cool videos I make, and about how often those videos come out, and how missing out on a video can be avoided somehow, huh? Are these clues helping you, huh? Fuck it, just show the prompt. That's not even the right icon. It's supposed to be the finger, you know, the one that affords clicking. Who worked on this video's port? Panic Button? Panic Button worked on this. The Wolfenstein Switch port people. This is not their best work. Not their best work, this video. I've been thinking lately a lot about video game UI, or user interface, as it relates to immersion, and I want to talk about that. And I want you to listen to me talk about that, because apparently I'm an egomaniac. Or this medium just doesn't allow me to hear you talking. You can still talk, like respond in voice to the screen, that's great, but also if you could type out those responses in the comments below, that would be really helpful. Really, really helpful. So UI is basically all of the things that appear at the screen level and generally separate the player, even if only minimally, from the game space. A HUD, a heads-up display, is a good example of a common user interface, or a minimap, also a good example. Great examples, Caleb. Thanks, Caleb. I recently finished playing The Witness. Well, let me correct that. I recently finished looking up many puzzle solutions online to play my way through The Witness. The Witness is an incredible puzzle-solving game that's less about solving the puzzles and more about learning the rules to the puzzles. The game does this through implicit tutorializing. There's not much explicit tutorializing with The Witness. Only one button prompt that I remember. There's no written instructions to tell you what the rules are to each puzzle. Rather, the player is introduced over time to increasingly complex puzzles, all seeded by the first simple puzzle. Draw a line from the circle to the rounded end of the path. Pretty simple, right? But the game gets really, really, really hard. I don't believe anyone has ever 100% completed this game without help. Even if you told me about a guy who claims to have 100% completed this game without help, and that guy and I were to meet, discover that we have a lot in common, become best friends enough to share our deepest fears, darkest secrets, and biggest regrets, then when that person's mother dies, I'm the first person he calls, even before his siblings. Even with that level of trust built over a lifetime, if that person told me he 100% completed The Witness without help, I'd call him a liar right to his motherless face. One of the reasons the game is so hard is that it requires an incredible amount of awareness from the player. Every shadow, every line, every color, every asset in the game is a potential clue to help solve a puzzle. Now, over time, the player builds up a robust puzzle-solving toolset, but the game never lets up. To the very last puzzle, the witness is changing things, and the player must keep up. It's an incredibly well-designed game, but is that partly because of its lack of overt tutorializing, or is it a well-designed game in spite of this lack? Now, for a long time, I believed that on-screen button prompts in video games were kinda lazy. I felt that peak video game design meant building a play space so rich with affordance and feedback that players would frictionlessly and joyously discover the game mechanics and their associated inputs. After all, the promise of discovery is a powerful, direct motive. But Mike Bithell, who has made a lot of great games, including Thomas Was Alone, one of my very favorites, recently said something interesting that's changed my perspective. On episode 55 of the podcast Play, Watch, Listen, starting around minute 47, second 25, that's linked below, Mikey B, as his friends and me call him, dismissed the inherent goodness of an absent AI, saying it's really just an aesthetic choice. I was surprised by this, really, because Mikey B is an awesome game designer, and I had simply assumed every game designer would eliminate overt button prompts if they were capable enough and had enough resources and all that kind of stuff. I assumed it was an ideal that most, or if not all, game developers and designers reached for. He goes on to discuss UI in a way that made me realize UI generally, but on-screen button prompts specifically, aren't a sign of weakness, but they are a sign of efficiency. Games are input-output machines, and so to remove a very efficient output like button prompts means a lot of other considerations have to be made that aren't inherently beneficial to every video game. Regarding the topic of efficiency, let's say we've decided to get rid of on-screen button prompts for our newest side-scrolling platformer called Mikey B and the Educating Adventure. And for the sake of trademark infringement, forget that I mentioned Mike Bithell is also known as Mikey B. I mean, he's not really, but in the context of this joke, I don't want to feel like I'm going against a trademark that I myself create. I don't think that's possible. Anyway, so how would I teach the player that pressing the cross button, or the X button as it's colloquially known, causes Mikey B to jump? Okay, option 1, I could include a button configuration map in a settings menu, but that's still using UI, and so it is cheating a bit. Not to mention, I'd also have to rely on the player knowing how to even access the settings menu, and knowing that a settings menu would contain the button configurations in the first place. I mean, players probably would know these two latter things. Designers do have to trust gaming conventions to a point, which I'll bring up again in a few seconds, but I'm still making an assumption. There's a trade-off there. I could rely on the player brute forcing their way to learning. In this scenario, the player simply presses buttons to see what happens. But the problem there is that I can't trust players to do that. And it's harder for me as a game designer to then introduce contextual mechanics where the same button does something different under a changed context. There's a trade-off there. Option 3, I could rely on conventions, as mentioned earlier. In many PS4 side-scrolling platformers, the cross button is jump. That's what the phenomenal game Inside does, for example. There's no on-screen button prompts. The player just has to try different buttons to see what works. But then I have to hope that my player has played enough similarly mapped side-scrolling platformers to know the conventions, and doing this would weaken my ability to try new things with the buttons. Inside is a very mechanically simple game, so it gets away with relying on conventions. Again, there's a trade there. Then there's option 4. As I believe the best UI-less games do, I could design the world in a way that encourages discovery. If I wanted the player to push the right direction button to move Mikey B to the right, I could drop a rolling boulder to the left of Mikey B, forcing the player to do something to avoid death, that something being to push the right directional button, hopefully. And in this case, I'm using character death as a tool for learning, which generally players will see as unfair. And also it means I'm unable to then make a game in which the player character can't die. There's a trade-off there. So Mike Bithell's simple comment got me to realize that because there are game design restrictions that are introduced when a UI is removed, the lack of a UI therefore cannot be inherently good game design. I still believe in the power of no UI, I really do. When done well, it's certainly impressive and likely correlates to a great and intentional game overall. I would imagine that the skill required to indirectly tutorialize a player successfully would indicate a certain level of similar care and skill in designing the rest of the game. Also, I like when design is used well to convey a message, and a lack of UI at this moment in the long games industry timeline does convey a message. Inside, for example, is a very atmospheric game that feels isolating and is full of mysteries that are open to a player's interpretation, making a lack of UI a fitting artistic choice. The lack of UI is a choice that feeds on the player's perception of the game's intent. In other words, removing the UI from a medium that's consistently used UI is a statement. And not all games have a statement that can be conveyed with the help of an absent user interface. To put it more simply, consider if Nintendo released the next Mario game, but replaced Mario with a cracked toilet seat. The player would assume that change is purposeful and would mine the rest of the game to uncover that purpose. Or the player would recognize the incongruity, become frustrated, and abandon the game. Or the game would be super awesome, but that would be in spite of the radical deviation from convention, not because of it. Thanks to Mike Bithell, I've backed away from my view that a user interface, specifically button prompts, are lazy game design. I understand now that the decision to use a UI or not is just that, a decision. It's a choice with pros and cons, and is a choice that a game designer must make with consideration to the direction and intent of the game itself. Damn, that was a fun topic to think through. Thank you for listening to all of my blathering. Please tell me your thoughts on video game UI in the comments below. I respond to most comments. I love the conversation that happens down there. I think my video commenters are some of the best in the biz. I really do enjoy having awesome conversations with you guys in the comments. And if you are a game designer out there, did I get anything wrong? And also, did I get stuff right? I kind of want to know that too. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to make sure you don't miss future videos. If you're still watching this video, you obviously got something out of it, right? So it only makes sense to give it a thumbs up and subscribe.